Alright guys, welcome back to another episode of On Exotics. Today we have Marcelle from the Living Vivarium and Viper Brothers with us. We're going to be... Oh yeah, sorry. We're going to actually be covering a topic today that there's not really a lot of information about. A lot of you guys might have seen my previous video with respiratory infection in both colubrids and heavy-bodied snakes. I'll link it up here if you guys haven't seen it. Good video to watch, but this one, there's almost no info about online. You can go research it, you can go Google it. The answers you'll get are usually all just opinion based. So now we're going to expertise in it, right? So we're going to someone that's actually had experience in this matter and actually has successfully treated it on multiple occasions. So knowledge is king, guys. So that's what this video is going to be about. So Marcelle, in arboreal vipers, bro, obviously they're quite prone to respiratory infection, especially when they're neonates. What would you say are the main causes for any arboreal viper to actually get respiratory infection? Because if you think about it, it's strange to think that a snake that comes from high humidity conditions can actually get respiratory infection.
Okay, so as with any other reptile, and especially snakes, respiratory infection is predominantly caused by bacterial infection, but there are possibilities that respiratory infection actually gets caused by parasites. As well as environmental factors, like for instance mold in the enclosure can cause a form of respiratory infection. And then you also get symptoms that are similar to respiratory infection from basically, if you will, allergic reaction. For argument's sake, if you keep a snake on, let's say, aspen, it can have a reaction to some of the finer aspen powders. And it shows symptoms similar to respiratory infection, but it's not actually. Generally, that's restricted to nose bubbling, whereas obviously respiratory infection itself has quite an array of symptoms. But most often, it's bacterial infection, and it's caused by an immune deficiency when the snake is kept unideally, even if it's for a short period of time, by accident, power failure or whatever, and we all know how prone we are with that in South Africa.
Yeah, yes. Thanks to ESCOM. And I know another big reason for, I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in here, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I know a big reason for a lot of, especially neonate vipers getting respiratory infection is a lot of times we keep them in tubs with paper towel. And the reasons, from what I could hear from guys abroad, so I went abroad and asked a few guys as well, and it seems the 2 main reasons for respiratory infection in younger vipers is one, too much humidity,
and too low ventilation.
Yeah,
that does play a big role.
And because we're prone to keep them on paper towel when they're young, because I mean it's the most hygienic. Let's be realistic.
Also easy to maintain and
they
clean.
Poo, you just take the toilet paper out and that's done. So if you missed, and you missed that it got soggy, and your snake decides to chill in that sogginess, that's also a very big reason for ire, right?
Yeah, especially with low ventilation. You'll find more often than not, even if the cage is a little bit too damp, but you've got brilliant ventilation, they're less prone to it. But yeah, having a snake lying in damp conditions or extreme humidity, with especially lack of ventilation, is definitely a problem. Now, for instance, this tub over here, you guys can check the back, the top. None of it has. You guys can
come close and you can come check this out.
It doesn't have ventilation, it only has on the sides. Now, in my opinion, especially in arboreal vipers, if this was the case that we had an arboreal viper in here, it would be more prone to it. The ventilation in these are, in my opinion, not efficient or sufficient for keeping the majority of arboreals.
Because you'd need ventilation from the top as well.
Yeah, and obviously this is a straight through draft, and this fits in a rack, so there's minimal airflow. So you want different heights of holes to create airflow, and you want the humidity to escape through the top as well.
Alright dude, so now that we've looked at the main causes for respiratory infection, what would be the telltales so that you can actually, if your snake is showing symptoms for respiratory infection, how could you identify that?
Okay, so there's obviously a few different things that you can look out for. Firstly, something that I've seen quite often, especially for some reason in arboreal vipers, is throat puffing. So
which is where they
they'll sit with their head up slightly, and every now and then the throat will expand and stay there for a bit, and sink back down. So that's one thing.
Like a bullfrog.
Basically, yeah. So that's one thing. The other thing would be gaping. And gaping is usually also associated with a little bit of stargazing. So they'll sit with their heads up and their mouth slightly open. Then excessive mucus in the mouth.
That's where you physically see some bubbling, and when they open the mouth, some slime.
That's it. And then another thing, especially with arboreal vipers, especially since some of them can be so fussy to get feeding to start off with, more often than not, when they've got respiratory infection, they also actually stop feeding. So obviously there are very varied factors for a snake to stop feeding. I mean, a snake that goes into shed can also stop. So that's not 100% telltale, but more often than not, especially in slightly extreme cases of respiratory infection, the snake will stop feeding.
So it's a checking out its feeding habits is a good thing actually, because then obviously if you know that your snake doesn't eat during shed, then you know if it's not eating, it's not in shed, so got to check with something else, i.e. be it the enclosure conditions. Now guys, what Marcel's also saying now is very important, but that doesn't mean that every single time your snake refuses a meal, it's got RI. Don't stress your animals out by being like an overprotective parent, because that can actually cause more stress, and then that actually can lead to immunity deficiency, which can again lead to respiratory infection.
No, just because a snake's not feeding doesn't mean it has respiratory infection, but coupled with some of the other symptoms, it is a good indicator, but not on its own. There are too many factors for a snake not feeding to be straight up, no, it has to be a respiratory infection. So I'd rather look at throat puffing, stargazing, gaping, excessive saliva. And while the snake is breathing, also you'll quite often, especially difficult in smaller vipers, but for instance looking at adult eyelashes and so on, you'll often get a bit of a wheeze if you listen carefully. So instead of a normal breathing, it will have a slight wheeze in it, basically just like a human would.
So once we figured out that our snake has RI, what would you think is the best way to approach the treatment for arboreal vipers, especially because they're so prone to stressing out easily and then eventually rolling?
So basically my first approach with any snake that has respiratory infection is to look at environmental factors first. More often than not, in mild cases, you can actually treat the animal by playing around with humidity and temperature without needing to go to medication. From that point, you're going to stabilize your environment to the basic needs for the animal, as per the care sheets and the knowledgeable people you've spoken to, and from there you're going to have to move to medications. Now, obviously, ideally, you want to rather take the animal to a vet. They know the dosages, they know the dosages off by heart. It's definitely less risk and so on than just trying it yourself, especially if you're not experienced in it. But we also understand that a lot of people don't necessarily have access to a proper exotic vet. So those are the people that we want to focus on, I feel, today. It's people that can't get the stuff, or can get the stuff, but their vet doesn't really know what to do with a snake. He's not willing to work with a venomous snake, because even a lot of the exotic vets that I've used over the years, they're willing to help, but they're not going to deal with a venomous snake. So you're still doing the treatment yourself, just under supervision. So, like I say, those are the people we want to focus on, the people that don't have access to a vet. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show the basics of what I use. And like I said, if you've got access to a vet, rather go straight to him. Don't mess around with trying it yourself, especially if you don't have the exact formula on hand. I mean, various medications need to be mixed to dilute to ensure that the snake is not being overdosed and so on. But I just want to cover the basics of what I use and how I treat the different snakes that we're referring to in this video.
All right, perfect. Let's run through them.
Okay, so first of all, Batril. Batril antibiotic, it's quite a strong antibiotic, but it's one of the safer antibiotics. Generally, we use a 5% Batril solution at 1 ml per kilogram of body mass. Now, different medications with different strengths will need to be dosed differently. So
when you say 5% Batril, does that mean you diluted the Batril?
The Batril itself is 5%. So if you go to a vet and you tell him you need Batril, argument's sake, 15%, in theory they should have it. But we utilize
The 5%.
5%, and it comes like that from the manufacturer.
Perfect. Okay.
So it's already diluted to the ratio we need for the snakes.
Perfect.
Different brands obviously vary. A lot of companies make a form of Baytril, but it's their own form, and some of them are 10% or whatever. So I try to stick with Baytril 5%, then it decreases the amount of mixing you need to do, and it decreases the risk because it's already stabilized. If you use a 10%, you can't do 1 ml to a kilogram. You're going to have to
do 5 ml. No,
0.5
to a kilogram. Yeah.
because it's double the strength.
All right.
So that would be the first thing. Now, you also get other antibiotics like I just covered. This, for instance, here is amikacin. This tiny bottle, I can probably treat, no jokes, a few hundred arboreal vipers. This stuff is extremely strong. I prefer to use this in large-bodied snakes.
So everything from a yearling and older.
Not even. When I say large-bodied snakes, I'm not even
actually
referring
like
pythons and yeah, because it's so potent. Even the slightest misdose, especially in a small snake, can be dangerous.
I'm going to jump in on that. Again, guys, very, very important what Marcelle said, to make sure you're exact on dosing. It's a crucial thing to keep in mind, because you don't want to kill your snake when you're actually trying to help your snake.
That's it. So things like amikacin I stay away from, especially in smaller snakes. Then something, and this, to be quite frank, is something that over the years I figured out myself.
Along with knowledge.
Along with the Baytril, I like to use Ringer's lactate solution, which is basically, if you will, a drip that would be used on animals, the same as you would get in hospital. Now,
so like a saline.
Yes, that's it. So what I like to do with this is I like to add some of it into my Baytril. So I draw up the correct dosage for the snake. Let's say the snake's 1 kilogram. I don't know what sort of arboreal viper you're keeping if it's that weight, but
Mangshan.
yeah. So you've got your 1 kg Mangshan there. You've drawn up your 1 ml. Then I like to take roughly half of the dosage up to the same as the dosage. So if you've got 1 ml of Baytril, you can go 0.5 to 1 ml of Ringer's lactate. Now, simply it dilutes the medication, so it's not a system shot, but you've still got the right amount of medication. And it contains quite a bit of trace elements, minerals and vitamins that helps boost the snake a bit more. And that brings us to the last baby over here. Chiro B and liver protect. So that is a B12 complex with obviously a bit of liver protect in it. I usually dose this at the same ratio as the Baytril, 1 ml per kilogram roughly. But like with most most vitamin complexes, excess of it gets you. Yes, but if not prolonged, and if it's a short use, generally it gets urinated out and gets wasted. But I use 1 ml. I actually use this on some of my animals on occasional feeds into the rodents themselves.
Just to make sure the immunity probably stays up, because it is a massive immunity boost.
Yeah, that's it. So that's the 3 main items I would generally use in any oral treatment.
So that's Baytril, Complex B, liver support, and then
Ringer's
lactate solution.
Yeah, so basically what I would generally do is that would be used either in oral dosage or in prey injectable. So to give you guys an idea on just the basics here, to just simplify everything and stick with the average dosing that you would use per kilogram. From there, obviously, you can utilize it and dilute it as need be. I'll just give you guys a basic example. So generally, especially on arboreal vipers, you're not going to be using a 3 ml syringe. You're preferably going to be using an insulin syringe because it's finer in dosing. So, like I said, we're dealing with a 1 kg viper here. So you'll draw up 1 ml, and of course, there's going to be a little air bubble there for us. And we're a bit short, so you'll draw up your 1 ml. And obviously, especially when dosing, be as accurate as possible. Okay, then
probably better to underdose it, but then overdose as well.
I generally, especially in smaller snakes, if you need to go, argument's sake, 0.4 mils, I'd rather go 0.3 for safety's sake. Especially, once again, like we discussed, if you don't have access to a vet and you need to do it yourself.
Yeah.
So then from there, I'll just draw up round about the same amount. For the demonstration, I'll rather do half dose on B12. So there we've got 0.5. And then from there...
You hold it back.
Yeah, sure, man. Just some ringers. It will help if I stop shaking before I end up with B12.
Good smell, eh?
Yeah, the B12 has quite a pungent smell. Like I said earlier, about half to a full amount of your antibiotic dose. So now in theory, we've got enough medication there to treat a 1 kilogram snake fully for dose 1 of respiratory infection. Now, what I also like to do, especially since it's tubing the snake, I like to draw in extra air. From there you'll use your, well, it's basically a
feeding tube.
Feeding tube, yeah. Oddly enough, vets generally use these for either bird feeding or crop feeding.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it. And the other thing they use is in extremely ill animals, this would run through the nasal cavity down into the gut to feed as well. So from there, you'll just run your medication through to the tip of the tube as close as you can, because the tube actually has about 3 holes, one on either side and one at the tip.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
So that then will be slid down the snake's throat. I generally just use some water to lubricate it up. Obviously you can use egg whites and so on, but water generally does the trick.
Yeah, I think water would be good as well.
Now the other option that you will have, and if the snake is feeding, in my opinion this is 150% option number 1, is instead of tubing the snake and causing stress, you're going to use a rodent. Now, I don't want to dose up my rodents unnecessarily because none of my snakes are sick, but with the rodents what I generally do is I'll just go into a frozen forward, into the chest cavity about halfway. I'll inject the liquid in. You'll see the chest cavity and stomach puff up a bit. Slowly remove while applying a bit of pressure there just to seal up the hole as you come back out, and you'll inject all of your fluids in there.
So for example, if you're feeding a tiny little arboreal viper and you cut the pinky head up, what we did on my one video where I parasite flushed my whole collection, you guys should go check that video out as well. I'll link it up here as well. But when we did that, we actually went through the eye of the pinky head to get it like into the brain cavity as well.
Yeah, that works very well. The smaller the snake, the more difficult it is obviously to dose, but also, yes, you're going to end up having to dose a pinky head or whatever the case might be, but your quantity of medication becomes lower and lower as well, so it contains or stays in the prey item a lot easier. And what I also like to do, because obviously you want the medication to start taking effect as fast as possible.
ASAP.
So let's say your snake takes rat pups.
Okay.
I'm rather going to feed it a small fuzzy or a large pinky, so it still gets a meal, but it digests a lot quicker, so the medication kicks in a lot faster. Now, let's say you do have a snake that's not feeding, then you're going to have to go with the tubing method. So I did bring out a snake, it's not sick, that I'll show you guys the basic principle of tubing. It's non-venomous, it's a little splotch milk snake, Sinaloan, that we're just going to use as a demo. Now guys, to show you guys how little this snake is going to get stressed out.
Zoom in on this, on the snake when we get it out of here as well.
To show you guys how little the snake's going to be stressed out by the process, I'm actually going to give it the little pinky to feed shortly after I finished. Obviously, the snake not being sick, one can say it's unnecessary that we're doing it, but I want to show you guys the correct method of doing it to prevent a snake from getting injured. And once again, if done correctly and at a sufficient rate, the stress on the snake is minimal. And like I said, this animal is extremely used to handling. It's not too phased with anything pretty much. And to show you guys how little he's going to be stressed out, we'll give him the pinky after showing you.
It's an important part for Marcelle and both me, that you guys understand how to do it without injuring your snake. Because again, we all mean good, but if you don't know what you're doing and you're not experienced in what you're doing, you will 100% of the time cause more wrong than you would cause right. So again, the snake's not going to be stressed out. We're going to prove it to you guys after this, but it's a necessary part for the education of this video.
Now, if you put the tube down and accidentally extend it down the glottis instead of
which
the
is what
throat,
the glottis is what they breed out of.
It's in the bottom of the jaw, and quite often when a snake is swallowing a large prey item, you'll actually see it flopping from side to side, depending on where the rodent is, and it expands and it takes in oxygen that way. I mean, if you put the liquid down there by accident, you flooded the snake's lungs.
You drowned your snake.
So for this segment, we're going to pretend the snake's not in my hand and it's a venomous arboreal. So what I'd like to do is just off of the branch or wherever it's sitting, just use a fine tweezer grip to get hold of its head, where I can move my fingers into position to neck it. Now, any snake that's being necked generally reacts like this. So what I like to do is I'd like to untwist it as much as possible, just work it through into a position where I can stabilize it. Apparently it's not going to work with us today, but there we go. Then I like to use my pinky just to hold the snake in place like that. Then you're going to take your tube, which you would have prepared up front, just dip it in water, and like you would to inspect a snake's mouth that had a bark or whatever stuck, you're going to just use the tube as a tweezer almost and open the mouth softly, and then you go down the throat of the snake. Now these tubes, I'll just show you here, have a set of lines on them that you can see there, small little black dots. Now with snakes, obviously if you've got a tiny viper, you're going to go in less, and you want to keep the snake as straight as possible during this process. And you're just going to softly slide it down to the first line in small snakes, a bit further in big snakes. From there you're going to inject your liquid, and remember when we were talking about the tubing, I said the air pocket in the back. So that's just to force all the liquid out. Once the liquid or the tube looks roughly like this, just gently maneuver it past the teeth again and let the snake release it. And this part you want to be quite gentle, because it does sometimes bite down onto the tube and you obviously don't want to hurt the snake's jaw. So this guy's clenching down quite a bit. There we go, and the process is done.
How do we make sure that RI doesn't happen again? And how do we prevent it from spreading to the rest of our collection?
Obviously, when you figure out your snake has respiratory infection and it's not a factor like 2-day power cut thanks to ESCOM, then you're going to want to make sure your environment is correct. So basically, you're going to look at all your aspects, heating, humidity, and all of that in your enclosure and your setup, and make sure that it is to the T for the species. And then to prevent spread is quite simple. Generally, when it comes to sick snakes, I work with them last, firstly.
So do all your other tasks, and then as an end, you work with the individuals that require special attention.
That's it. And then over and above that, be as sterile and clean as possible. If you've got...
Take a shower, guys.
That might help. But if you've got, argument's sake, a group of eyelash vipers, separate the sick one out, because the direct contact can spread the bacterial issue that is 100%. Causing. And if you're using a hook stick on the sick snake, don't run to the next cage and hook out a healthy snake. If there's any saliva or so on that's spread to the hook stick by some chance, you have the chance of spreading it to your healthy snakes. So, by principle, work with the sick stuff last, keep your equipment sterile, and your environment as sterile as possible to prevent the spread of the illness.
Yo, bro, pass it to me. Hello. Hello. Alright, guys, this is Mowgli, Marcelle's baby. He's a Kawati bear, and he's amazing.
You're not going to have a white shirt anymore now.
That's fine. Alright, guys, from Ohana Exotics, this has been a blast. We say peace out and much love. Oh, check out the description below. I'm going to link Marcelle's, both of his Viper Brothers and his Living Vivarium Instagram page. And then I'm going to link his YouTube channel, which is going to start soon.
It's not active yet, but we're getting there.
We're going to get there, guys. We're going to get there. So from Ohana Exotics and from Viper Brothers, Marcelle, the Living Vivarium, peace out.